If you have had your podcast for any length of time, then you've probably heard that podcast guesting is a great way to grow your audience until you try it and get zero ROI from the guest appearances that you do. So in this episode, I have invited podcast guesting expert and the founder of Hell Yes Media, Kelly Moser, to join us and talk about why this happens and the biggest mistakes to avoid when it comes to guesting on other podcasts so that you can get the most out of every podcast guest appearance that you do so that it actually converts more listeners to your podcast and more leads to your business. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Kelly, welcome. Oh, we have so much to dig into today. This is a topic we have not yet explored on the podcast, really talking about the guesting side of things, how to pitch yourself as a guest, how to be a better guest, and then how to have better guests on your show. So thank you for making the time to be here today.
Courtney, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be sitting down with you.
Well, a lot of people who listen to this show, most people have a podcast. For everyone who has a podcast, we all want to grow that show. And for many of us, we've heard, if we want to grow our podcast audience, you got to focus your efforts on the people who already listen to podcasts. Makes total sense. But then what usually happens, and I know what happened in my case early on when I started my show, was when I heard that, I was like, great, okay, I'm going to pour all my efforts into podcast guesting, only to wind up with zero ROI in terms of listeners or revenue to show for it. So given your expertise, I'd love to hear your take on why is it that you think this happens?
It's such a good question. This is the exact same experience that I had myself too. Someone told me, hey, if you want to grow your podcast, you really should get out there and start guesting. And I didn't realize that there is a strategy to guesting that I had never heard before. Nobody was teaching that to me when I Googled how to be a podcast guest. I didn't get any really of the strategy to be successful as a guest. You can find a pitch and how to land a spot on a show, but getting onto the show is really just the beginning. When you're on that show, it's how you contribute, it's how you communicate, it's how you position yourself that really makes all the difference in the world in terms of ROI. So I love that we're starting here because it's one of those things that it's going to take time for you to do. It's not like something you can snap your fingers and in 5 minutes you have a podcast pitched and booked and recorded. This is something that's going to take some time. So if you're going to put in that time and effort and energy, we want to make sure that you're getting something out of it. And I think the number one thing, there's a couple things that I see guests do that as I'm listening sometimes to a podcast that I really like, I'm like, oh, if this guest, I can tell when a guest is not going to see ROI from an interview. And I'm like, I just wish they had done this one thing. The number one thing that I think people do starts way before the interview, before anybody presses record. And that is aligning with the host on what you're going to be talking about. Because I think for a lot of guests, we think, oh, I want to grow my show. I know who my audience is. Let me think about the first question they ask themselves is, what do I think this podcast that I know I'd be a good fit for because that's my audience, what do I think they might want to talk to me about? And when you come to it from that perspective, you're neglecting everything that would actually make you the most impactful on that show. So a lot of people, the first question they ask is, what podcast do I want to be on? And what do I think that podcast would want to talk to me about? We're going to reverse the order of operations there and instead think, what is the conversation that I am the best at? What is the best value I can bring that aligns best with what I'm covering on my podcast and what my offers are in my business? Because that's where you're going to see the ROI, is where it is the logical next step for someone after they hear you on a podcast to come check out your podcast or to come sign up for your program or to look at your sales page. That's when you're going to see the best ROI. So that's what you've got to start with is, what is that, signature conversation that I should be having everywhere? Not how do I fit myself into this podcast and make sure that they want to interview me? It's what is the conversation that I can bring that's going to change the most lives, bring the most value? And then what are the podcasts that are going to be open to having that conversation with me? And a lot of times that podcast is not the same one that you were initially thinking, oh yeah, that's the right fit for me to go on. A lot of times it's a different niche, or it's more specific, or it's a different demographic of people. So starting with content and then finding the show and the audience that is going to be the most open to having you to talk about that content is, I think, the most important thing.
Kelly, you are speaking to my soul right now. And it's crushed in a little bit because, for me, when I first started podcast guesting, I did everything all wrong. I did all the things you're saying not to do, right? Where I was like, okay, what are the biggest shows I could get on? What are the, highest ranking shows I could get on? What are the shows that maybe, my topic is adjacent enough that it would make sense to have a conversation around? And then even, I would say recently within the past 18 months or so, there was a podcast tour that I did where my podcast was not yet fully aligned with our company and what we do and how we serve and support people. And so I was having these amazing conversations on podcasts, but they were not directly impacting the business in any way whatsoever. It was a very inspirational conversation, but it didn't do anything to the bottom line. And there were a lot of hours spent to pitch, to land those interviews, to actually do the thing, to promote it afterwards, all for nothing. And that could be really kind of gut-wrenching when you realize that, how much energy and efforts. I know you're speaking to a lot of people right now when you mention this, and thinking about it differently. So something else that I know that you teach and that you focus on a lot, which I love, is beginning with the end in mind, which we hear this in all aspects of our business. But for you specifically, you say start with your call to action. Don't let that be an afterthought. Can you unpack this for us and why, if you want to go on a podcast tour and for it to actually yield an ROI for your business, this is the first step that we need to start with?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Your call to action is so important. And I know a lot of people already are like, I don't want to offer a call to action. I don't want to be salesy. Listen, if you've just given someone 30 minutes of value, the kind thing to do is to give them somewhere to go next. You're not forcing anybody to do anything. You're just saying, if this conversation that you just heard was helpful to you and valuable to you, there is somewhere you can go next. And you want to make sure that that is where you're letting people know that that next step exists, because otherwise they're just going to walk away and think that was great, but now I'm stuck. Now I'm confused. Like they helped me in 30 minutes and that was great, but I still have questions. I still want to know what the next step is. So the most important thing you can do as you're thinking about a podcast tour is to start with the end in mind, which is, what is the business objective that you want to drive with this podcast tour? Is it to grow your podcast? Is it to fill spots in a program? Is it to book one-on-one consults so that you can help people one-on-one? You've really got to think about that first. And I would discourage you from trying to do too much with one podcast tour. So it might be the case that one conversation can fill multiple offers for you. It can grow your podcast and fill your offers. In fact, hopefully it does, because that would mean there's great congruency in what you're offering versus, the content that you're sharing for free out there in the world. But don't try to fill this program and this program and this program and this offer and this, your YouTube and your podcast with one podcast tour. Just focus on one thing and figure out what the highest priority thing is for you. And then you're going to reverse engineer the rest of your podcast guesting strategy from that. So let's say you are a coach or a consultant, you've got a high ticket one-to-one offer. What is the content that someone needs to hear in order to feel ready to book a consult with you or to book a discovery call with you? And then that's the content that you're going to need to start to back yourself into. So if the end goal is to have somebody sign up for your high ticket one-on-one coaching, the step before that, the next touch point right before that is going to be maybe your consult or a sales call or discovery call with you. That's going to be your call to action at the end of your podcast. And you want to make sure your podcast interviews, and you want to make sure that the value proposition is really clear there. So people want to understand exactly what they're going to get out of any step that you offer them, any invitation that you give them, anywhere in the process. So if they book a discovery call with you, tell them exactly what they're going to walk away from that discovery call with. So yes, maybe it's an opportunity for you to talk about your high ticket paid offer with them, but also make sure that they're going to get something else out of that conversation. And what is that? Because at the end of your podcast episode, when you've just given this incredible interview, you're going to say, thank you so much for having me on this podcast. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. If anyone's listening and today, you learned X, Y, and Z, and that was really exciting for you, the next step for you is 1, 2, 3. Maybe it's a sales call with you. Maybe it's a lead magnet that you have that's going to help them more. So we're always thinking about moving people forward along this buying journey, not a lateral movement, and certainly not a step backwards. Because what I see almost everybody do at the end of a podcast interview, if they haven't learned, the proper strategy, is they'll say something like, yeah, if you liked this episode, follow me on Instagram or go to my website. And it's like, what's waiting for me there? I don't know. If I think about what people are doing when they're listening to a podcast, right? Like they're driving, they're grocery shopping. They might not be able to go to your website right now. So if you don't give them a good reason to go somewhere specific and take some specific action, they're probably not going to do it. So your call to action definitely important, and making sure that it aligns with your end biggest business goal, and then reverse engineering everything from there and making sure that it all flows really seamlessly. So it makes sense for someone to go from listening to your episode to your call to action into your paid offers.
This makes so much sense. We haven't even gotten to the end of the episode yet, and I already want to go back and re-listen to everything that you're saying. And this is something too, Kelly, that I feel like a lot of people struggle with, which is, okay, where am I leading people? What's the best call to action? And I don't know what you would say to this, but is there a right or wrong? Is there a bit of testing that would go into this? I know if we're going on a designated podcast tour, we don't want to waste the opportunities that we have to get in front of those aligned audiences by maybe giving the wrong call to action. Do you have a process for figuring out what the best call to action might be? And is there any expectation we should have as far as, do we need to test this? Do we need to give this some time to see what converts?
Great question. I definitely think testing is always the answer. Whenever we go into something expecting 100% that it's going to work, we're going to be disappointed. So go into your podcast tour with a little bit of flexibility, saying to yourself, okay, what I find works really well is actually a 2-tier call to action. So if you're still in the process of figuring out exactly which call to action has the best conversion for you, what I would recommend doing, first of all, don't tell people to go to your Instagram first. Like, don't tell them that. They're not going to go. They're just not going to do it. So what I would recommend doing is thinking about one call to action that maybe is a little bit more effort for them, and one that's a little bit less effort. You can think of this as a little bit more risk, a little bit less risk as well. So for you, that might be inviting people to book a call with you. That might be kind of your higher risk. I'm using air quotes when I'm saying that risk, because it's just a risk of time, right? They're going to take 30 minutes to talk to you. And some people might consider that a risk. It's just a little bit more effort. So your primary CTA might be to book that call with you. And then you can say, if you're not quite ready for that, I also have this other thing that might be a free training that they can watch independently. That's a little bit less effort for them. It's a little bit less risk because they can just download it and have it. Or maybe the second tier is to join your newsletter, where every week you supply tips about X, Y, and Z. You're being really specific. It's not just get on my newsletter. Like, no one's going to join it if they don't know exactly what's waiting for them there. So that's something I would recommend, something that's a little bit higher risk. So you capture the people that are ready to go, that are ready to talk to you right now. And then something that's a little bit less risk and a little bit less effort on their part. So the people that aren't quite ready to get on a 30-minute call with you right now still have a way to get a little bit more help, get into your world. We want them to just be in your world somewhere. And they're more likely to do that if they understand exactly what they're going to get from taking either of those next steps.
This is brilliant. There's a phrase that we've mentioned a couple of times here that I would just want to unpack with you a little bit more as well. This idea of a podcast tour. Can you just tell us, what do you mean by a podcast tour? And also, why does this differ from doing, let's say, an ongoing amount of interviews, like 2 interviews a week or 2 interviews a month, or whatever that ongoing strategy might look like? What's the psychology behind that, and why is it more effective?
Yes. So I like to think about a podcast tour as an intentional sprint with a lot of structure that's built around a specific goal, where you're taking the same content strategy around with you to every show that you're guesting on. You're offering the same CTA, unless you're finding out that CTA is not working, and then you're shifting it and optimizing it. But you're basically doing the work one time and then leveraging the work on different podcasts. That's kind of the concept of the tour. It's got a start date, it's got an end date, it's got goals. You can more easily measure your conversions if you're kind of clustering your interviews around one specific period of time during the year. So maybe you've got a launch coming up, or maybe once a year you open the doors to a program that you offer. That's when I would focus your podcast tour, because you're going to have a lot of impact in a short amount of time. It's really easy to measure your success. And then you can kind of step away from it at the end and evaluate and analyze the results that you got. That, to me, is more optimal, especially if you are looking to promote something specific in your business. If you have evergreen offers that run all the time, I think it's okay eventually to get in the rhythm of doing 1 or 2 podcast interviews a month, or whatever you feel comfortable and you have the bandwidth to do. But to start out, we want to collect as much data as possible so that we can make informed decisions moving forward. Because if you start off saying, I'm going to do 1 interview a month for the next 6 months, well, it might be a few months before those interviews are actually released, which means it's a few months until we have the data that we need to tell you whether or not what you're doing is working. And by that point, when you figure out, oh, this really isn't working, oh, shoot, I just recorded an interview last week with the exact same strategy that I know now isn't really working. So that's kind of why I like to cluster interviews, at least for your first podcast guesting adventure. Like, let's really make it intentional and strategic. That way, also, you can do a little bit less work. You're just planning the podcast tour one time and going around and delivering that exact same content, that same conversation on 10 to 15 podcasts within a 12-week period. That's going to give you really good insight and really good data that will help you inform what you do next.
This makes a lot of sense. It allows you to iterate so much faster. And like you said, get those results that much faster so that then you can iterate again and really dial that in and streamline that in versus saying, oh, I'm going to do 2 episodes a month for the next year. And then here we are a year later, and we may or may not have seen some results from, that long drawn out strategy. But like you said, to the point where once it is dialed in, then you can just work that into your marketing, work that into something that you do naturally, both to grow your podcast and to grow your awareness and grow your audience.
Absolutely. And it might be that that podcast tour makes sense for you to just run over and over and over. Or maybe you run that tour once a year, and then 3 months later in the year, you run a different tour because you've got different stuff going on in your business at that time. But you know that every January you should re-engage this one tour with this one specific set of content, because what podcast audiences and listeners are thinking about at that time of year are these 5 things that you can really speak to that's really seasonal. And then in the summer, maybe you go on a different podcast tour and you talk about a different topic because that aligns with what you've got going on in your business at that time of year. And it also aligns with what people are thinking about and focused on at that time of year. So you can definitely tap into and out of your podcast tour whenever it makes sense. And that kind of gives you a little bit more people. I know people are like, well, I care about these 3 different things and I can't just pick one for my podcast tour. You can always run another one. But I promise you're going to see you're going to see better results if you just focus. I know focus is like one of the hardest things as an entrepreneur when you've got so many ideas and you care about so many different things. But if you do focus in shorter sprints, it's going to pay off so much in the long run.
Well, let's talk next steps from here. So we're beginning with the end in mind, dialing in that call to action. From here, can you give us a look at what comes next? What should we be thinking about next in terms of positioning our expertise to pick topics to pitch? And then what does it look like to find the right podcast to pitch? How do we know those shows are going to be worth our time? And when it comes to making the ask, maybe a couple of quick do's and don'ts when it comes to actually pitching yourself to get on those podcasts.
Yeah, of course. So right now, if you're sitting here thinking, I really want to start podcast guesting, think about that end goal for the next 6 months. Give yourself a little bit more time for your first podcast tour, because once you get in your rhythm, you will be able to expedite everything much faster. But think about, okay, what's my goal that I want to focus on for the next 6 months in my business? What's the program or the, lead generator that I really want to focus on bringing people to? And then back into it and say, where do people need to be in order to take that final step with me? Do they need a sales conversation? Do they need that one-on-one time to get their questions answered? Do they need to watch my signature training where I lay out the whole process for them, exactly what they're going to, experience if they come and purchase that thing? Think about where they need to end up at the end of the podcast episode. And then start to think about, what are the beliefs, the thoughts, the misconceptions, the myths that they're going to need unpacked for them during a podcast conversation? What are they going to need to understand about the process? Like you and I talked today a lot about process, so people understand what's all entailed in if I want to go out and book myself as a guest. So think about, what processes do they need to understand? What myths, misconceptions, what mindset things might they be holding on to right now that in order to be ready to take that next step with you, they're going to need to shift. That's really what's going to be the best content for your conversation. So then you can start to think about, okay, now I've really figured out what people need to hear from me in order to feel ready and empowered to take that next step at the end of the interview. And now think about, how do I make this really interesting? So how do I think about what that audience, what my ideal client really wants, and build my episode proposal around that? So when you're starting to outreach, pitch yourself to these podcasts, you want to be pitching just one conversation. So not one topic, not sales, not podcasting, not marketing, not team engagement, not retention. You want to be proposing one specific episode idea. So that might look like, and think of it really in terms of value and practicality and how tangible it is for the audience. So if you're someone who focuses on customer retention, we don't want to just pitch customer retention as an episode topic because that's just too big an umbrella. So we want to think about something more specific. So for you, maybe it's how to increase your client retention by 20% without XYZ, or in the next 6 months, or even if you don't have a big team to support you. So you're starting to think about specific conversations that are going to be really impactful and tangibly valuable to that audience. And then you're going to think about, okay, who's the person that's ready to hear that conversation? Where are they already hanging out? And we want to think about, okay, if I'm the retention expert, I'm probably not going to want to pitch myself to other podcasts that are specifically about retention, because that host might see me as competition. They might see me as a threat. Ideally, in a perfect world, we'd all see each other as collaborators and not competition. But in reality, there are egos involved here. So don't put yourself in a position where you're pitching someone who does the exact same thing that you do. But you can think about adjacent topics. So if somebody's listening to a podcast about client retention, maybe they're also listening to a podcast about running ads. Maybe they're also listening to podcasts about being a great leader or workplace balance, work-life balance. Those are the podcasts where you can be the go-to retention person. So there's kind of two ways you can go. You can say, okay, I'm going to kind of fight for breadcrumbs a little bit and look for a seat on a retention podcast that talks all about my topic all the time. Or I can be the one person that's talking about my topic on a podcast where they don't typically talk about this exact thing. They're talking to the right people and we're in the right vicinity. We're still talking about business and, success at work, but they don't talk about retention all the time. Because guess what? Then you could be a recurring guest on that show. So anytime they want to talk about retention, they'll bring you back on. So we're thinking about not just how do I get myself involved in these great podcasts that are having these great conversations, but how do I become an invaluable contributor to them and land almost like a residency on that podcast, even get asked back again and again, and build relationships with that audience. And that's how you're going to see the best long-term ROI out of all the effort that you're going to put in to find these interviews.
Kelly, this is so good. I love the way that you approach this, the way that you think through this. There's no one else in the industry that's got the strategy like this dialed in when it comes to podcast guesting. And I know that you know equally as much for the other side of the mic as well, how to get the most out of your guests as a podcast host. And I'm super stoked to dig into that with you in the next episode. So thank you for letting us peek inside your brain today and for all of the wisdom, insight, and just practical, tangible steps forward that you have shared with us.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad we got to have this conversation. And if you are listening to this episode and you're a host who wants to do more guesting, but you want to do it really intentionally, I have a wonderful free masterclass that would really help you. We talk about pitching, like the specific ins and outs of pitching, how to structure your signature content for your pitch. And then we go deeper into monetization, making sure that those listeners become leads without any salesiness or ickiness that doesn't feel right to you. So that masterclass would probably be a wonderful next step. And if you want to connect with me, I would love to hear what you thought of this episode. If you share that you listened to it to your stories, tag me and Courtney, and I would love to follow along with you and listen to your podcast because I'm always looking for new podcasts to listen to myself. So would love to connect with you there.
I love it. Kelly, thank you again so much. And if you're listening right now and you got value from this episode, I would love it if you would take 30 seconds and write a review and let me know. Or at the very least, tap the 5 stars on Apple or on Spotify. And then make sure you head to the show notes so that you can connect with Kelly and learn more from her. She is an invaluable resource when it comes to podcast guesting and also when it comes to preparing guests for your podcast. So don't go anywhere because in the next episode, Kelly is going to join us back to talk about how to do that, how to prepare your guests, how to get the most out of the conversations that you have with your guests on your show, and how to actually get them to share their episode once it airs. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.